The mud of Viridia 7th was a living thing, a thick, glutinous soup of reddish-brown clay and pulverized flora that sucked at a soldier's boots with a greedy, sighing sound. It was a world that was actively trying to digest the war, and Corporal Elias Thorne, designation Doc, was beginning to take it personally. The air was a thick cocktail of ozone, cordite, and the sickly sweet copper tang of Corel plasma discharge. Above, the sky was a bruised, yellowish purple, a permanent twilight filtered through an atmosphere choked with orbital debris and the smoke of burning biomass. The sound of the battle was a rhythmic, ripping cacophony, the heavy, percussive thump-thump-thump of human auto-rifles answered by the sharp, melodic shriek of the Corel plasmacasters. It was a miserable place to be and an even worse place to be wounded. "Medic! God, get a medic! Chen's hit! Chen's down!" The scream cut through the din, high and terrified. Elias was already moving, his head down, his medical pack seeming to weigh 1,000 pounds as he half ran, half crawled through the sucking mud of the trench line. The 73rd Human Infantry Battalion was in the process of being systematically dismantled, and this small trench on the western flank was the epicenter of the Corel's latest push. He slid into the dugout next to Lieutenant Graves, who was frantically trying to get a signal on his comms. "Where?" Elias yelled over the noise. Graves didn't even look at him, his face a mask of grime and stress. "Forget it, Doc. He's in the open, 20 meters out. He's a write-off. We're pulling back in 2 mics." Elias ignored him. He peeked over the Vha'Rakk lip of the trench. He saw him. Private Chen, a kid barely 19, was sprawled in a shallow crater, his lower body a ruin. One leg was gone below the knee, the other a mangled mess of flesh and shattered bone, the wound seared and cauterized by the plasma bolt that had torn through him. He was alive, feebly trying to raise his rifle with one hand. 20 meters of open churning mud separated them. A Corel Scythe, so named for its tall, impossibly thin, multi-jointed body and the sweeping scythe-like motions of its plasma caster, was advancing on the position, its movements fluid and predatory. To the Corel, the battle was already won. Wounded soldiers were a logistical burden, a non-asset. The Scythe was moving in to cleanse the field, as was their doctrine. "Damn it, Thorne." "That's an order," Graves shouted, grabbing his shoulder. Elias shook him off, his voice a low, cold growl. "My orders are different." He checked the charge on his primary trauma kit, slung his rifle over his back, and vaulted over the trench wall. The air exploded around him. The Scythe, surprised by the illogical advance, sent a plasma bolt sizzling past his head, so close he felt the air crackle with static and the sharp smell of burnt hair. He didn't run in a straight line. He ran like a broken field runner, slipping and sliding in the mud, using the churned earth as cover. He heard the thump-thump of Graves and the rest of his squad providing covering fire, their initial shock, overcome by the sheer stubborn audacity of his charge. He dove the last 5 meters, landing in the crater with a bone-jarring impact that sent a fresh wave of agony through his already screaming knees. "Just leave me, Doc," Chen gasped, his face the color of wet ash. "Can't feel my legs." "Good," Elias grunted, his hands already a blur. "Then this won't hurt." He slapped a wide-area biofoam applicator onto the worst of the wounds, the gray, expanding foam sealing arteries and nerve endings with a medicated hiss. He hit him with a high-dose, wide-spectrum painkiller, jamming the injector hard against his neck. The Scythe was closer now, its movements precise, ignoring the covering fire as it prioritized the new, illogical target. Elias saw its multifaceted eyes, cold and dark as oil. He didn't have time to be a medic anymore. He ripped his rifle from his back, chambered around, and braced himself on the crater's edge. The Scythe raised its weapon. Elias didn't aim for the head or chest. He aimed for the joint of the weapon-bearing arm, the one weak point his training had drilled into him. He fired a single controlled 3-round burst. The round struck true. The Scythe shrieked, a sound like tortured metal as its arm splintered, its weapon clattering into the mud. It staggered back, its perfect, logical advance broken. Elias didn't wait. He grabbed Chen by the harness of his body armor and began The long, agonizing crawl back to the trench, dragging 180 pounds of wounded man and gear through a sea of mud that fought him every inch of the way. When he finally tumbled back over the wall, collapsing in a heap of exhaustion and adrenaline, Lieutenant Graves just stared at him, his face a mixture of disbelief and awe. The 73rd was broken, the battle lost, but Elias Thorne, following a different doctrine, had just refused to let the enemy balance their ledger. Vha'Rakk, High Conduit of the 11th Karel Phalanx, observed the final cleansing of the battlefield from the serene, sterile interface of his command vessel, the logical conclusion. His ship hung in low stationary orbit, a perfect obsidian teardrop against the jaundiced clouds of Viridia 7. Vha'Rakk was the epitome of his species, tall, slender, his chitinous exoskeleton, a polished, functional work of art. His mind was a place of cold, clear equations, where variables like morale and despair were simply footnotes to the hard, clean mathematics of attrition. The battle for the Western Firebase, designate Trench Line 7, had been a predictable success. The human unit, 73rd Infantry Battalion, had been stubborn, but ultimately inefficient. He reviewed the battlefield data, his multifaceted eyes scanning holographic displays that showed troop movements, casualty rates, and resource expenditures. His logic core, the ship's tactical AI, had already compiled the report. The 73rd Battalion, which had begun the engagement with a roster of 784 combat-effective personnel, now had a certified casualty rate of 68.3%. The Karel doctrine was clear. Any unit suffering casualties over 40% was designated redlined. It was non-operational, its command structure shattered, its combat effectiveness reduced to 0. It was, for all strategic purposes, dead. Vha'Rakk's long four-fingered hand gestured, and the file on the 73rd was marked as archived cleansed. He had removed them from the strategic map. A subroutine flagged an anomaly for his review. A small glowing window opened, replaying the illogical advance from the final moments of the battle. He watched a single human combat support unit, a medic, his logic core identified it, charge into open fire to retrieve a single critically wounded non-asset. He then watched the same medic engage and disable a Karel Scythe before retreating. Vha'Rakk processed the information. Analysis? He projected, his voice a series of soft, resonant clicks. The logic core's synthesized voice was smooth and dispassionate. Action is designated as a cascade failure of the human's rudimentary emotional survival protocols. The medic unit exhibited self-preservation deviancy, prioritizing a non-asset over the integrity of the squad and its own primary function. This is a common, though inefficient, flaw in human combat doctrine. It is a weakness to be exploited. Vha'Rakk concurred. This human tendency for sentimentality was a massive drain on their resources, a foolish waste of personnel. He dismissed the footage. The medic's suicidal bravery was irrelevant. The 73rd was broken, and that was the only fact that mattered. He turned his attention to the next phase of the campaign, the assault on Hill 218, a key strategic high ground, now defended by what his intelligence correctly identified as a fresh, inexperienced human unit, the 101st Recon. With the veteran 73rd gone, he anticipated a swift, clean, and efficient victory. The logic was flawless. The place was nicknamed the Greenhouse, and it was the closest thing to hell Elias had ever seen. It was a massive, bombed-out agricultural dome, its plasteel panels shattered, its internal climate systems long dead. Now it was the 73rd's Battalion Aid Station, a sprawling, chaotic city of pain. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptics, blood, and burnt flesh. The sound was a constant, low-level chorus of groans, whispered prayers, and the sharp, clinical commands of the medical staff. Wounded soldiers lay on stretchers on makeshift cots on the bare dirt floor. This was the butcher's shop, and Elias, covered in Chen's blood and Viridian mud, felt a familiar, crushing weariness settle on him as he helped the orderlies lift his patient onto a triage table. A figure in a blood-stained surgical gown moved toward them with an energy that seemed to defy the exhaustion blanketing the dome. "What do you have for me, Doc?" Captain Eva Rostova, chief surgeon of the 73rd, didn't look up from the data slate in her hand. She was a small, sharp woman with dark hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her eyes into a permanent, intense squint. She was, in Elias's opinion, a miracle worker with a scalpel and a goddess of logistics. "Private Chen, ma'am," Elias reported, his voice cracking with dehydration. "Plasma blast lower extremities. Complete loss of left leg below the knee. Right leg has massive arterial, nerve, and bone trauma. I applied 2 units of biofoam, a full-spectrum stabilizer, and a high-dose analgesic." Rostova's eyes finally flicked up, scanning Chen's vitals on the monitor above the table. Then the wounds themselves. Then Elias. Her gaze was sharp, analytical, and held a flicker of something he'd learned to recognize. Profound, weary respect. "You went out for this one, didn't you, Thorne?" she asked, her hands already at work, cutting away the foam-caked remnants of Chen's trousers. "He was alive, ma'am." "So are you. Barely." She barked orders to a nurse. "Get him on a full-spectrum nutrient drip and 2 units of ONEG. I need a vascular clamp, a bone saw, and prep him for a full system flush. The leg's gone, but we can save the life. The right leg. We'll see." She looked back at Elias. "You're walking wounded, Doc. Get yourself to the green tag area. Get some fluids, and get some sleep. That's an order." Elias just nodded, his body finally registering its own complaints. He stumbled away from the table, toward the relative quiet of the light wound area, leaving Chen in the savagely competent hands of his captain. This was the part the Corel never saw. This was the human doctrine the logic core couldn't compute. To Vha'Rakk, the battle was over, the assets expended. To Captain Rostova, the battle had just begun. All through the long yellow night, she and her team worked in the bloody chaos of the greenhouse. They didn't just save lives. They performed complex, delicate microsurgery under primitive field expedient conditions. They fought infections, stabilized shattered bones, and carefully prepared stumps for the high-tech prosthetics that were already being requisitioned from Central Command. They were not just healers. They were master carpenters, mechanics of the human body, their sole purpose to take what was broken and make it functional again. They were the first and most critical link in the chain of the Lazarus core. By the time the false jaundiced dawn broke over Viridia 7, Private Chen was alive, stabilized, and already en route to the rear line recovery base, his life saved, his combat career just beginning its next unexpected chapter. Valhalla was a sprawling underground complex of repurposed mining tunnels, far behind the front lines. It was a place of sterile white walls, advanced fabrication bays, and the constant quiet hum of medical machinery. It was also, Elias thought, one of the noisiest places he'd ever been. It was filled with the sound of whirring servo motors, the sharp clang of weights in the rehabilitation gyms, and the constant, profane and remarkably loud complaining of recovering soldiers. 3 weeks had passed since the disaster at Trench Line 7. The 73rd Battalion, or what was left of it, had been officially pulled back for refit and reorganization. To the Corel, this was the final confirmation of the unit's demise. 2. The humans, it was just Phase 2. Elias walked into the primary rehab gym, the air smelling of sweat and ozone. The place was packed. Soldiers with gleaming prosthetic arms were in pull-up competitions. A woman with a newly grafted synth skin mask over her burn scars was patiently teaching a nervous-looking FNG, a fucking new guy, how to strip a heavy pulse rifle. And in the center of the room, bracketed by parallel bars, was Private Chen. He was sweating, his face a mask of furious concentration, his new matte black prosthetic leg taking a hesitant, shuddering step. "Don't favor it, Chen," a voice barked. Sergeant Mila Vha'Rakk, who had lost her entire left arm to a scythe 3 months prior, stood watching him, her own high-tech prosthetic tapping impatiently on the floor. "That leg is better than the one God gave you. It won't get tired, it won't freeze, and it won't feel pain. Trust the damn thing." Chen grunted, his knuckles white on the bars, and took another, firmer step. A group of fresh-faced recruits, their uniforms still clean, watched from the sidelines with a mixture of horror and awe. Chen, seeing them stare, snarled, "What are you looking at, meat? You ever seen a man walk before?" One of the recruits, trying to be respectful, said, We just heard about you, sir. The man from Trench Line 7. Chen laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Don't call me sir, I work for a living. And you heard wrong. I'm not the man from Trench Line 7, I'm the man who's going back to Trench Line 7. And when I go, this time I'm taking that Scythe's ugly head as a souvenir. Sergeant Vha'Rakk grinned. All right, hero, that's enough. Hit the showers. She turned to the FNGs. Listen up, you children. You are now members of the 73rd. This isn't a normal infantry unit. This is the goddamn Lazarus Corps. Everyone you see in this room, everyone who will be leading you has already died once. They've been shot, burned, and blown apart by the Scythes, and they're still here. They are harder, meaner, and smarter than any fresh-faced recruit. And they are your new gods. Your job is to listen to them, learn from them, and try not to get them killed again. Am I clear? A chorus of terrified, "Yes, Sergeant," was her answer. Elias leaned against the wall, a rare small smile on his face. The Corel were right. The 73rd was broken, but it was being rebuilt, its gaps filled with new flesh, its spine reinforced with the tempered steel of its own returning, battle-hardened ghosts. Vha'Rakk was about to attack Hill 218, expecting to find lambs. He was about to walk into a den of lions. High Conduit Vha'Rakk processed the final pre-engagement logistics with a serene, dispassionate focus. The assault on Hill 218 was not a gamble. It was a foregone conclusion, a mathematical certainty waiting to be physically demonstrated. His logic core had analyzed every variable. The terrain, the atmospheric conditions, the predicted capabilities of the human 101st Reconnaissance Battalion, and the flawless operational status of his own 11th Phalanx. The resulting probability of success was 97.4%. The 2.6% margin of error was a standard, acceptable allowance for unpredictable cosmic phenomena, such as a localized meteor strike or a spontaneous stellar flare. The possibility of failure at the hands of the enemy was statistically 0. The 101st was a green unit recently deployed to the theater with no significant combat experience. They were an equation with a low integer. Easily solved. Commence the cleansing protocol, Vha'Rakk projected, his voice a calm series of clicks that echoed in the quiet, minimalist bridge of the logical conclusion. Below him, on the bruised surface of Viridia 7, the first wave of the Corel assault began to move. It was a thing of terrible geometric beauty. Scythes advanced in perfect, staggered formations, their tall, slender bodies moving through the sucking mud, with an unnatural grace. Their plasma casters held at a precise 45-degree angle. They did not shout or roar. They moved in a disciplined, predatory silence, their footfalls calculated to minimize sound and maximize speed. They were the physical manifestation of a perfect algorithm of war, and Hill 218 was simply the next variable to be processed and deleted. Vha'Rakk watched the main holographic display, his multifaceted eyes tracking the silent, flowing icons of his troops as they converged on the human position. He felt no excitement, no anticipation. He felt only the quiet satisfaction of a complex problem being solved with elegant, overwhelming logic. Private Miller, whose 19th birthday was still 3 weeks away, was not feeling a quiet satisfaction. He was feeling a primal, gut-twisting terror that threatened to turn his insides to water. He lay pressed into the mud of his foxhole on the forward slope of Hill 218, his brand-new auto rifle shaking so badly he was afraid he'd drop it. He could see them. The Scythes. They were just as the vids had shown, but worse. They moved like nightmares, silent and inexorable, their forms half hidden by the swirling yellow mist. He could hear the panicked, shallow breaths of the other FNGs in his squad, a frantic chorus of boys trying to remember their training, while staring death in its cold, alien face. Their platoon leader, a fresh-faced lieutenant barely older than they were, was whispering frantic, contradictory orders into his comms. The 101st Recon was about to break before the first shot was even fired. Then, a heavy metallic hand clamped down on his shoulder. He flinched, looking up into the hard, scarred face of Sergeant Eva Rostova. Her prosthetic arm, a marvel of dull, non-reflective alloys and exposed myomer bundles, held him with a grip that was as steady as the mountain beneath them. "Breathe. Miller," she said, her voice a low, gravelly growl that cut through his panic like a saw. "They bleed. They break. They die. Just like us. The only difference is, we come back." She looked out over the lip of the foxhole, her expression one of bored contempt. "Look at 'em. Perfect formation, perfect advance, they're predictable. They're coming right where we want 'em." She tapped her prosthetic fingers on the stock of her own rifle. "Wait for my mark. Aim for the joints. And for God's sake, try not to piss yourself. It makes the trench smell worse." A ripple of grim, terrified laughter went through the squad. Sergeant Hadek's calm, almost casual demeanor was more reassuring than any inspirational speech. The Corel advance was now within optimal range. They raised their plasma casters in perfect silent unison. "Mark!" Hadek roared, and the entire crest of Hill 218 erupted in a storm of disciplined, concentrated auto rifle fire that was anything but the work of panicked green recruits. On the bridge of the logical conclusion, the first red icons of Corel, casualties began to blink on Vha'Rakk's holographic display, a full 90 seconds ahead of the logic core's earliest projection. It was the first dissonant note in his perfect symphony of war. The Corel's opening plasma volley was a beautiful, deadly wave of incandescent energy that washed over the human lines, turning ferrocrete barriers to slag and boiling the mud in the trenches. It was designed to shatter the morale of a new unit, to create a breach through pure, overwhelming shock and awe. It failed. The human line bent, but it did not break. When the Corel scythes began their final fluid charge up the slope, expecting to sweep through scattered and terrified survivors, they were met with a wall of violence that was as savage as it was tactically sound. Sergeant Hadek was a whirlwind of controlled fury. She used her prosthetic arm not as a replacement, but as a weapon. She braced her heavy-bore rifle against its unyielding frame, turning it into a perfectly stable firing platform that allowed her to fire with a speed and accuracy that was mechanically impossible for a normal human. She punched through the thin armor of a scythe's leg joint, then, without missing a beat, used the same arm to haul a wounded FNG back into cover, the servos in her shoulder whining with the strain. Not far down the line, a new legend was being forged in the mud. Private Chen, his face a grim mask of concentration, was a demon on the left flank. His new leg was a marvel. He could drop to a kneeling position with a speed that defied biology, his prosthetic locking into place to create a tripod of unshakable stability. He became a fixed turret of death, pouring accurate, sustained fire into the advancing Corel. When a plasma blast struck the ground near him, sending a shock wave that would have shattered a human ankle, his prosthetic simply absorbed the impact, the advanced polymers and shock absorbers doing their job. A scythe, recognizing him as a key threat, broke from the line and charged him directly. It was a mistake. Chen grinned, a terrifying, feral expression. He let the creature get close. Then, instead of firing, he swung his prosthetic leg in a brutal, sweeping arc. The heavy alloy limb, powered by his own adrenaline-fueled muscles, connected with the scythe's delicate torso with a sickening crunch of chitin. The Corel warrior was thrown sideways, its charge broken, its body shattered. Chen then calmly raised his rifle and put a 3-round burst into its head. He had his souvenir, and through it all, the medics moved. But this was not the desperate, isolated chaos of Trench Line 7. This was a system. Elias Thorne was no longer a lone wolf. He was the tip of a ruthlessly efficient spear. When a soldier went down, Elias was there in seconds, not just with biofoam and painkillers, but with a homing beacon. He would slap the beacon onto the soldier's armor, administer immediate, life-saving aid, and get back into the fight. Moments later, a heavy-lift evac drone, its rotors screaming, would descend through the smoke and fire, homing in on the beacon. Its armored claws would grab the wounded soldier and whisk them away from the battlefield before the Corel could even register them as a non-asset. The entire process, from wound to evacuation, took less than 90 seconds. On the bridge of the logical conclusion, Vha'Rakk watched in disbelief. His casualty reports on the humans were almost non-existent. Soldiers would be hit, their biosigns would flicker to critical, and then they would simply vanish from the battlefield. It was as if the human army was a tide, and every time one of its waves crashed and broke upon the shore, the ocean simply pulled it back to be reformed. The attrition rates were not just off, they were inverted. For every Corel warrior his forces cleansed, it seemed 2 more battle-hardened human veterans took their place. The logic of the battle was beginning to crumble. "Explain this deviation," Vha'Rakk projected, his voice losing its serene calm for the first time, replaced by a cold, sharp edge of command. The holographic display before him was a mess of contradictory data. The 11th Phalanx was taking casualties at a rate 3 times the projected maximum. The human unit, designated 101st Recon, was not breaking. It was not even bending. It was holding the line with a level of tactical discipline and fire control that was rated for a veteran-class heavy infantry battalion. Worse, his scythes were reporting contact with enemy combatants utilizing unorthodox physical capabilities. Reports spoke of soldiers with impossible strength, unshakable aim, and a terrifying resistance to kinetic shock. "The logic core is recalibrating high conduit," the ship's synthesized voice replied. "The enemy's combat effectiveness vastly exceeds all known parameters for a new unit. There are unknown variables present. A deep-spectrum battlefield scan is recommended to identify these variables." "Authorize it," Vha'Rakk commanded. He watched as a new series of sensor sweeps washed over the holographic battlefield. This was no longer just a tactical scan. It was a deep, invasive analysis, peeling back the layers of the battle to look at the very composition of the combatants. It scanned for energy signatures, for material composition, for biological markers. The data began to flow back, and the logic core began to build a new, horrifying picture. A series of windows opened on the main display. Each showed a human soldier, highlighted in red. The first was Sergeant Mila Hadek. The logic core's analysis was brutally efficient. Subject: human female. Designation: Hadek, M Unit, 73rd Infantry Battalion. Status: redlined. Confirmed non-asset from engagement at Trench Line 7. Left appendage lost to plasma discharge. Current analysis detects high-grade alloy and myomer bundle prosthetic replacing lost limb. Combat effectiveness is calculated at 137% of baseline human soldier. Another window opened. Subject: human, male. Designation: Chen, P. Unit: 73rd Infantry Battalion. Status: redlined. Confirmed non-asset critical lower body trauma. Current analysis detects advanced polymer and carbon nanotube prosthetic replacing lost limb. Subject is exhibiting tactical stability and mobility exceeding baseline by 182%. The windows kept opening, one after another. Dozens of them. Soldiers who had been shot, burned, and maimed at Trench Line 7. Soldiers who had been officially and logically written off as dead, as non-assets, as red-lined casualties removed from the equation of the war. They were all here. They were all fighting, and they were all better. The logic core, in its dispassionate synthesized voice, delivered its final, devastating conclusion. High Conduit, a doctrinal paradox has been identified. The unit defending Hill 218 is not the 101st Recon. Biosignature and hardware analysis confirms the presence of at least 63 red-lined assets from the 73rd Infantry Battalion. Our primary opponent is a unit that has already been neutralized. We are engaging a ghost battalion. My casualty projections are invalid. My strategic recommendations are based on a flawed core premise. The logic has failed. Vha'Rakk stared at the screen, at the faces of the dead men and women who were now systematically dismantling his perfect logical assault. His entire understanding of warfare, the serene, predictable mathematics of attrition that had guided his species for 1,000 years, had just been rendered obsolete. He had not accounted for an enemy that treated its fallen not as a liability, but as raw material for a stronger, more terrifying army. The cost of this new doctrine was paid in fresh blood. The FNGs of the 101st were fighting with a courage, They didn't know they possessed, inspired by the impossible resilience of the veterans around them. But their inexperience was still a harsh reality. Elias found himself working on a kid named Miller, the same terrified Private Sergeant Vha'Rakk had calmed just hours before. A piece of shrapnel had torn through his side, a messy, ugly wound. "It hurts, Doc. God, it hurts," Miller gasped, his face pale with shock, his eyes wide with the betrayal of his own mortality. "I know, kid. I know," Elias said softly, his hands moving with a speed and confidence that belied his exhaustion. He applied a coagulant patch, injected a painkiller, and slapped an evac beacon onto the boy's chest. "You're going to be okay. You did good. You held the line." Miller's eyes fluttered, the analgesics taking hold. Am I gonna come back, Doc?" he whispered. Elias met the boy's gaze, and for the first time he offered a truth that was also a promise. "Yeah, kid," he said. "We all come back." The Corel assault began to falter. The Scythes were not programmed for this. Their doctrine was to apply overwhelming force to a single point, create a breach, and exploit the resulting chaos. But there was no chaos. The human line was a living, breathing thing. It would give way in one section, only to be reinforced by a flanking maneuver from a squad led by a soldier who should have been dead. Their logical, predictable attacks were being met with illogical, adaptive, and infuriatingly resilient defenses. The ghosts of the 73rd were everywhere, their experience allowing them to anticipate the Corel's moves, their rebuilt bodies allowing them to survive attacks that would have killed a normal soldier. On the bridge of the logical conclusion, Vha'Rakk was trapped in a feedback loop of failed logic. The logic core was now useless, offering only a series of cascading error messages. Paradox, paradox. Non-asset is performing as hyper-asset. Attrition model is inverted. The battle was no longer a mathematical equation. It was a chaotic, organic, and deeply frustrating mess. He could commit his reserves, send a second wave of scythes into the meat grinder, but to what end? His core strategy was based on breaking the enemy, on making them a non-asset. But what was the point of killing an enemy that simply refused to die? What was the logic in expending his own valuable, irreplaceable warriors to create more of the enemy's battle-hardened, cybernetic veterans? He watched as the last of his first wave was cut down or forced into a chaotic retreat down the muddy slopes of Hill 218. The human position was not just holding, it was advancing, securing the ground his scythes had just abandoned. He looked at the holographic display, at the blinking icons of his own mounting losses, and at the calm, steady icons of the human force. And for the first time in his long, logical life, High Conduit Vha'Rakk made a decision that was not based on probability, but on a new, cold, and deeply unsettling emotion. He ordered the retreat. The assault was over. He had lost the battle. For Hill 218, a battle his every calculation had told him he was guaranteed to win. He stared at the roster of the 73rd Infantry Battalion, the dead men who had beaten him, and knew that he was no longer fighting a war against a species. He was fighting a war against a concept he had no name for, a doctrine of compassionate, stubborn, and brutally efficient resurrection. The silence on the bridge of the logical conclusion was no longer serene. It was a cold, suffocating vacuum, filled with the unspoken reality of Vha'Rakk's failure. His report, transmitted via quantum-entangled tight beam to the Corel overlogic, on the homeworld, was a sterile, factual account of the battle for Hill 218. He detailed the flawed initial assessment, the enemy's unexpected composition, and the paradoxical resurrection of the 73rd Infantry Battalion. He included the deep spectrum analysis of Sergeant Vha'Rakk and Private Chen, highlighting their cybernetic enhancements and their combat effectiveness ratings. He concluded his report with his decision to retreat, citing the logical conclusion that continued engagement would result in an unacceptable attrition ratio, with no clear path to strategic victory. He had in essence informed High Command that he had encountered an enemy he could not calculate, and therefore could not defeat. The response from the overlogic was not immediate. For 3 full cycles, Vha'Rakk was left to orbit the bruised, yellow skies of Viridia 7, his own thoughts a repeating broken loop of error messages. His entire existence had been predicated on the belief that the universe was a solvable equation. War was simply the most complex, most violent branch of mathematics. But the humans had introduced a variable that was not on any of his charts. They were not just illogical, they were anti-logic. They did not accept the fundamental premise of attrition. They did not honor the simple, clean arithmetic of death. They had taken a negative number, a casualty, and by some grotesque, inefficient, and horrifyingly effective alchemy, had turned it into a positive. The 73rd was not just a battalion of soldiers. It was a self-correcting, self-improving algorithm of warfare, an army that learned from its mistakes and incorporated those lessons by literally rebuilding its own broken parts into something stronger. When the reply from the Overlogic finally came, it was not a reprimand. It was a directive, cold and absolute, that chilled Vha'Rakk to his very core. The Overlogic, a collective of the Corel's most ancient and powerful minds, had analyzed his data. Their conclusion was not that the humans were strong. It was that they were diseased. This doctrine of resurrection, this Lazarus protocol, was an aberration, a violation of the natural, logical order of the cosmos. A unit that is redlined must stay redlined. To defy this was a form of strategic heresy that, if allowed to spread, could unravel the very fabric of Corel dominance. The humans were not just an enemy to be defeated. They were a contagion to be studied and purged. Vha'Rakk's new orders were simple and horrifying. He was to cease all large-scale tactical engagements. His new primary objective was to secure a live specimen of the Lazarus strain for vivisection and doctrinal analysis. He was no longer a general. He was a biologist, tasked with capturing the most dangerous creature in the galaxy, a human veteran who had already died once. The victory at Hill 218 was not celebrated with parades. It was marked by the quiet, grim satisfaction of a job well done and the immediate crushing workload of its aftermath. Elias Thorne spent 36 hours straight in the greenhouse, which had been moved to a more secure position just behind the new front line. The cost of holding the hill had been high. The 101st Recon, the FNGs, had borne the brunt of the Corel's initial perfect assault. Elias worked on wound after wound, his hands steady, his heart a cold, hard stone in his chest. He saw Private Miller, the kid who had been so terrified, come in on an evac drone, his side a mess, but his eyes bright with adrenaline and the dawning, terrible realization that he had survived. "I'm coming back, right, Doc?" Miller asked, his voice strong, a stark contrast to his first whispered plea. Elias nodded, slapping a beacon on him for the next transport to Valhalla. "You held the line, soldier. You're one of us now. Go. Get better. Get stronger." The integration was complete. The 101st no longer existed. They were now just members of the 73rd. The green recruits who had survived were baptized in the plasma and mud of Hill 218, and they now looked at the ghosts with a fierce, almost religious devotion. Vha'Rakk Chen and the other veterans were their living saints, proof that even death could be defied. This new 73rd was a hybrid, a perfect synthesis of the new and the old. The veterans provided the experience, the unshakable core of resilience that had broken the Corel's logic. The new blood provided the manpower, the fresh energy, and a burning desire to prove themselves worthy of the Lazarus Corps' name. Captain Rostova, the chief surgeon, saw the battalion's new strength, but she also saw its hidden terrible cost. She saw it in the phantom limb pain that haunted Sergeant Vha'Rakk in the quiet hours, a pain her prosthetic's neural interface couldn't always mask. She saw it in Private Chen's new, reckless aggression, a young man overcompensating for his lost biology with a savage, almost suicidal bravery. And she saw it in Elias, the man who held them all together. He was the confessor, the anchor, the one who saw them at their most broken and guided them to their rebirth. But the weight of it was crushing him. He rarely slept, his nights filled with the paperwork of the wounded and the quiet, grim task of cleaning his gear for the next fight. "You're the heart of this battalion, Elias," Rostova told him one evening, forcing a nutrient ration into his hand. "But even a heart can break. You need to rest." Elias just shook his head, his eyes on the long list of the newly wounded. "They're waiting, Captain. The logic doesn't stop, and neither can we." The new 73rd was given a week of refit, a week to integrate its new members and upgrade its returning ghosts. Then High Command gave them their new impossible task. They were to be the vanguard, the spearhead for a full-scale assault on the Corel's primary command and control hub for the entire continent, the fortified city of Vitar. It was a suicide mission for any other unit. For the Lazarus Corps, it was just the next logical step. Vha'Rakk knew he could not meet the Lazarus Corps in open battle. His previous failure had proven the futility of that. His new objective required precision, not power. He needed a specimen. His logic core, now focused on abduction rather than annihilation, analyzed the 73rd's movements, its patrol patterns, its leadership structure. It identified a single high-value target that perfectly matched the Overlogic's request, Sergeant Mila Hadek. She was a documented first-generation Lazarus soldier. Her cybernetics were extensive, and she consistently led high-risk reconnaissance patrols. She was, in Vha'Rakk's new cold calculus, the perfect specimen. The trap was set with a logician's care. Vha'Rakk leaked falsified data suggesting a weakness in his own supply lines, a convoy of valuable plasma cores moving through a dense jungle-choked ravine. It was a tempting target, one that would require a small veteran-led team to exploit. Hadek predictably took the bait. She led her squad, a mix of 3 veterans and 5 of the new blooded rookies from the 101st, into the ravine. Elias, at his own insistence, went with them. "Someone's got to patch him up when they get too brave," he'd told her, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. The ambush was sprung with silent, chilling efficiency. Corel stalkers, specialized sensor-dampened units, emerged from the mud and foliage, not with plasma casters, but with high-frequency synaptic disruption rifles. Their goal was not to kill, but to paralyze. The rookies, despite their new confidence, were outmatched, their rifles useless against enemies they couldn't see until it was too late. One by one, they were tagged, collapsing without a sound. Elias and Chen, fighting back-to-back, managed to create a small perimeter, but the stalkers were everywhere. Hadek was the clear target. 3 stalkers converged on her, their disruptors focusing on her neural interface. Her prosthetic arm seized, locking in place. She roared in frustration and pain, swinging the inert, heavy limb like a club. But she was overwhelmed. A synaptic bolt struck her in the chest and her legs buckled. She fell, conscious but immobile. "Doc, they're taking her. They're taking Hadek," Chen yelled, his prosthetic leg churning mud as he tried to push forward, but a stalker's bolt took him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Elias saw it. He saw the stalkers attaching a grav harness to Hadek's paralyzed form. He saw their cold, multifaceted eyes devoid of malice, the eyes of a biologist collecting a sample. Vha'Rakk had made one critical, logical error. He had assumed that because Hadek was a hyper-asset, the other humans would be considered lesser assets. He had not calculated the illogical, emotional bonds of a human fire team. He had not calculated what Sergeant Hadek meant to them. "Chen, on me," Elias roared, his voice a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. He didn't reach for his medkit. He grabbed 2 plasma core grenades from a fallen rookie's belt and charged. It was Trench Line 7 all over again, but this time, he was not a medic. He was an avenger. He ran straight into the stalkers, a screaming, mud-covered angel of death. Chen, right behind him, used his prosthetic leg to launch himself from the ground, tackling a stalker and crushing its chitinous chest with the sheer, unthinking force of his cybernetic limb. The Corel, so focused on their delicate surgical abduction, were completely unprepared for this savage, suicidal, and utterly illogical counterassault. Elias didn't stop until he reached Hadek, tossing the primed grenades into the midst of the retreating stalkers. The resulting explosion tore the ravine apart, sealing the passage and ending the fight. Elias slid to his knees beside Hadek, his rifle forgotten, his hands already at work, injecting a neural blocker reversal agent into her neck. She was safe. They were all safe. On the logical conclusion, Vha'Rakk watched the mission data flatline. His surgical strike had failed. He had lost a dozen elite stalkers, and he had not just failed to capture his specimen, he had confirmed, in the most violent way possible, the very paradox he was trying to understand. These humans would rather die for a single damaged asset than live by the logic of attrition. His worldview was not just cracked, it was shattering. The failed abduction broke something in Vha'Rakk. The Overlogic's response was swift and merciless. He was stripped of his command, his phalanx reassigned. But Vha'Rakk, in a final illogical act of his own, refused the order. He cut his quantum entanglement link to the homeworld, effectively marooning himself and his ship. His logic core warned him that his actions were treason, a fatal error in judgment. Vha'Rakk simply replied, "The logic is already flawed. I must find the new variable." He was a being adrift, his entire system of belief destroyed. He had to understand. He took a personal dropship, a single Scythe escort, and descended from his perfectly logical ship into the chaotic, muddy hell of Viridia 7. He was going to find the answer, or he was going to die. The final assault on Vitar was a brutal, grinding campaign. The 73rd was in the vanguard, as promised. They were a terror, a battalion of ghosts and demigods who seemed to be in all places at once, breaking corral lines and holding impossible positions. Elias was in the thick of it, as always, working in a forward aid station just behind the main assault. The battle was chaotic, a swirling mess of urban combat. It was in this chaos that he saw them. 2 corral walking alone through a blasted-out plaza, their plasma casters held in a non-threatening downward position. One was a Scythe. The other was tall, his chitinous armor a polished ceremonial black. It was Vha'Rakk. Before Elias could sound an alarm, a human sniper's round ricocheted off the plaza fountain. Vha'Rakk's Scythe escort reacted instantly, shoving the high conduit to the ground and raising its weapon. In that same instant, a second sniper shot, this one true, struck the Scythe in its chest, punching through its armor. The Scythe collapsed. Vha'Rakk was alone, his weapon still at his side, as a human fire team led by a newly promoted Corporal Miller swarmed his position. "Don't kill him!" Elias roared, sprinting across the plaza. "He's a prisoner!" Miller's squad, recognizing Doc Thorne, hesitated, their rifles trained on the alien leader. Vha'Rakk did not move. He simply stared at the fallen Scythe, his bodyguard, as its life fluid began to pool in the dust. He had come for an answer, and he had found only more death. Elias shoved his way through the rifles, his medkit already in his hand. He didn't even look at Vha'Rakk. He dropped to his knees beside the dying Corel Scythe. "Get me a plasma cauterizer. Now!" He barked at a startled Miller. "And get a perimeter." He cut away the Scythe's shattered armor, exposing the wound. It was mortal. The high-velocity round had shattered the creature's primary respiratory spiracle. It was choking to death on its own fluids. Elias looked at the alien, at its multifaceted eyes, which were now glazed with pain and confusion. He knew he couldn't save it, but his doctrine was different. Vha'Rakk watched, his mind a silent void as the human medic, the same medic from Trenchline 7, the same illogical variable that had started this all, began to work. He watched as Elias Thorne, his face a mask. A profound concentration gently cleared the Scythe's airway, applied a pressure bandage, and injected it with a high-dose human painkiller. It was a futile gesture. The creature was a non-asset. It was dead. The act was a complete and total waste of precious time and resources. It was, by every definition of Corel logic, an act of pure, unfiltered insanity. The Scythe's pained, wheezing breath softened. Its tense, multi-jointed limbs relaxed. The pain was gone. It looked at Elias, and then at Vha'Rakk, and then its multifaceted eyes went dark. Elias stayed there for a long moment, then slowly began to pack his kit. He finally stood and faced Vha'Rakk. The Corel High Conduit, the master of logic, looked at the human medic, his face streaked with mud, blood, and sweat. "Why?" Vha'Rakk projected, his voice a low, broken click. It was not a tactical question. It was not a strategic inquiry. It was a philosophical plea. It was a non-asset, expended. Your logic is flawed. This is inefficient. Elias Thorne looked at the alien, his eyes filled with a weariness that went beyond the battle, beyond the war itself. He was just a medic, a carpenter of broken bodies. But in that moment, he was the ambassador for his entire insane, compassionate species. Because it was in pain, Elias said, his voice quiet. Our logic is just different. We don't just fight to win, Vha'Rakk. We fight to save. And that means everyone. He gestured to the dead Scythe. No one dies alone. No one gets left behind. Not even him. Vha'Rakk stared at the human, and the final, beautiful, terrible variable slotted into place. The Corel's entire doctrine of war was based on the efficient destruction of assets. The humans was based on the inefficient preservation of life, and in the long, brutal arithmetic of the cosmos, Vha'Rakk finally understood which equation was stronger. The war was over. The logic had been defeated.